This is the story of Richard Cole and his wife Amara Cole. They had been married for 11 years before either of them thought to question what the other one actually needed. Richard was the kind of man who loved loudly in the beginning. Grand gestures, remembered anniversaries, a way of making Amara feel like the axis around which everything turned. And then, somewhere in the middle years, love became assumption. Amara, for her part, had learned to need less or to pretend she did, which is not the same thing at all. The tension between them was never volcanic. It was the slow, grinding kind, tectonic, invisible until the ground finally split. What would unravel them was not a single betrayal, but the accumulation of small silences. And then, when the silence grew unbearable, the terrible things people do to feel powerful again. The kitchen in the Cole house smelled of coffee and dish soap every morning, which was one of those details that felt like comfort until it felt like monotony. Richard left for work at 7:15. Amara, who worked from home as a medical billing consultant, would stand at the counter with her mug for several minutes after his car pulled out of the driveway, not because she was savoring anything, but because the house felt different without him in it. And she wasn't sure anymore whether different meant better or simply quieter. They had met at a friend's outdoor wedding in Connecticut 11 years ago. Amara had been wearing a yellow dress that Richard still mentioned sometimes, usually with a kind of wistfulness that she had stopped finding romantic and started finding strange, as though he were mourning a version of her that had simply grown up. He was an attorney, civil litigation, precise and methodical in the way that can read as strength until you live inside it. She had mistaken his certainty for stability. It was an understandable mistake. Their daughter Nadia was 9, and she was the best thing about them without either of them having to say so. Nadia had Richard's jaw and Amara's patience, and she moved through their household with the intuitive diplomacy of a child who has learned to read weather systems in adult faces. On a Tuesday in October, Amara's colleague Marcus Whitfield came by the house to drop off paperwork, a practice audit that needed her signature before close of business. Marcus was easy to be around in the way that some people simply are, unguarded, a little self-deprecating, genuinely curious about other people. He and Amara had worked together for 3 years. He knew about Nadia's soccer schedule and Richard's habit of working Saturdays, and the fact that Amara had once wanted to open a small practice of her own before the timing never quite aligned. Richard came home to find them at the kitchen table, papers spread between them, Amara laughing at something Marcus had said. It was not a suspicious scene. Anyone watching it would have seen 2 colleagues finishing a task. But Richard stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, and something moved across his face. Not quite jealousy, not quite anger, more like the recognition of something he couldn't name and didn't want to examine. "Long day?" Amara asked. "The usual," he said. He shook Marcus's hand. He was cordial and perfectly pleasant. He offered nothing more. That night, after Nadia was asleep, Richard sat on the edge of their bed, looking at his phone. Amara came out of the bathroom, face washed, and noticed the particular angle of his shoulders. Slightly forward, closed, and chose not to ask. "You seemed off when you came home," she said, setting her moisturizer on the dresser. "I was tired." "Okay." She got into bed. He stayed where he was for another few minutes, thumbs moving over his phone screen, and she watched the ceiling and felt the distance between them as something almost physical. Not the mattress, not the 3 feet of bedsheet between them, but something older and less tangible than that. The distance that develops when 2 people stop being curious about each other. She turned off her lamp. He said, "Is Marcus the one who calls a lot?" "He calls when there's work." "Yes." A pause. "That's fine," Richard said, but the way he said it, careful, quiet, with the controlled neutrality of a man who had decided to file something away rather than address it, told Amara that it wasn't quite, or that it wouldn't be. She had known Richard long enough to know that he didn't let things go. He stored them. And then one day, he would present them, organized and annotated and slightly distorted by the time they had spent in his keeping. She didn't say anything else. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and then stopped. This was how most of their nights ended now. Not badly, not well, just ended. The messages started innocently enough, which is how most things that later become complicated tend to start. Marcus texted about work. Amara replied about work. And then, gradually, the way it happens when people genuinely like each other and spend hours on the phone discussing billing codes and insurance claims and the particular absurdity of healthcare administration. The crease. Texts edged into other territory. Complaints about the industry. Recommendations for podcasts. A photograph he sent once of a restaurant where she'd mentioned wanting to eat, just to say I walked past it. You should go. She showed Nadia that one. Nadia said it looked fancy. They were not having an affair. This is important, and it is also the kind of statement that people in Richard's position find infuriating because it sounds like a legal defense. But it was true. What they had was the kind of intimacy that doesn't require any particular act to feel threatening to a marriage. The intimacy of being known, of someone asking how she was and actually waiting for the answer. Richard found the texts in November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. He had picked up her phone to check the weather because his was charging, and the screen lit with a notification, Marcus's name, a message that said, simply, thinking about you today. Hope the audit is going okay. And Richard stood in the kitchen holding his wife's phone with the quiet, airless feeling of a man who has suspected something for weeks and still isn't prepared to have it confirmed. He read the thread, all of it, back through September, August, July. He read carefully, the way he read depositions, looking for contradictions, for admissions, for structure. What he found was a portrait of his wife that unsettled him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was so clearly her. The cadence of her humor, the precise way she described frustration, the warmth she extended to someone who asked. And he had not been the recipient of any of it for longer than he wanted to calculate. He put the phone down. He went upstairs. He sat at his desk and did not do any work. Later, Amara came upstairs and found him there. Have you eaten? She asked. I had something. She leaned in the doorway. She was wearing the gray cardigan she wore on cold evenings, the one with the fraying right cuff that she'd meant to repair for a year. You seem distant. I'm working. She looked at his blank screen. He caught her looking. He moved the mouse to wake it. Richard. I said I'm working, Amara. She didn't push. She went back downstairs. She reheated the leftover soup she'd made for Nadia and sat alone at the kitchen table and felt, without fully articulating it, that something had shifted. She didn't know what. She hadn't done anything wrong. And yet she had learned, over 11 years, that Richard's silences weren't about nothing. They were about something specific that he was deciding how to use. She texted Marcus, "It's getting worse here. Not sure he even knows why he's unhappy." Sorry, not your problem. She hesitated, then sent it. He replied, You don't have to apologize for saying things out loud. That's all you're doing. She sat with that for a moment, then she washed her bowl and went to check on Nadia. Upstairs, Richard had the thread open on his own phone now, screenshots he'd taken before putting hers down. He was reading them again, and he was already doing what lawyers do instinctively with information. He was building a case. He wasn't thinking yet about what he wanted from that case. He hadn't reached the question of what the endgame looked like. He just kept reading and organizing, and the part of his brain that had spent 20 years in courtrooms was arranging the evidence before the emotional part had even caught up, which was the most Richard thing imaginable. And somewhere in the middle of it, he must have been on his 4th or 5th read of the thread. He paused on one exchange from late August where Amara had written, I keep trying to remember the last time he asked about my day and actually cared about the answer. And Marcus had replied, and she had written, I can't remember. Richard read that sentence 3 times. And then he closed the phone and sat in the dark of his office for a long time with the complicated private experience of a man who has been told something true that he did not want to hear, and has immediately begun constructing a reason why it isn't. Amara was still downstairs. She was reading a novel she'd started in September and hadn't been able to finish. She kept losing her place. She'd read the same paragraph 4 times. She looked up from the book for a moment. not at anything, just up. And then she said quietly, to no one in particular, I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something. She blinked, shook her head slightly, set the book down. It passed. She picked up the book again. Richard filed for divorce in January. He told Amara on a Sunday morning, Nadia at her grandmother's, snow coming down outside in that half-hearted winter way, more atmospheric than accumulative. He told her at the kitchen table, which Amara later thought was very Richard, neutral territory. No bed between them, no doorway to retreat through. The kitchen was where they had always had the conversations that mattered. I've been to see David, he said. David Hartley, his colleague and personal attorney. He's going to represent me. Amara put her coffee down. Okay. I think it's the right decision. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and there was something in his expression she recognized, the controlled openness he wore in court, the face that gives nothing away and is meant to disarm. She had always found it fascinating in the abstract. Aimed at her, at this table in their kitchen, it was something else. Do you want to talk about it? She asked. I think we've been not talking about things for long enough. That's true, she said, and she meant it. What followed was not an argument. It was closer to an autopsy, quiet, methodical, both of them describing the same body from different angles. Richard spoke about the texts. He was measured and precise, citing specific dates and phrases the way he might cite precedent, and Amara sat with her hands around her mug and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, We weren't having an affair. I know what I read. Then you know we weren't having an affair. What you were having, Richard said, was a relationship with someone who wasn't me, and you were telling him things. He stopped, started again. You told him you couldn't remember the last time I asked about your day. Is that untrue? He didn't answer. Richard, is it untrue? You should have said that to me. I tried. She wasn't angry. She was tired in the particular way of someone who has been patient for so long that patience has stopped feeling like a virtue and started feeling like a wound. I tried to say things like that, and you filed them away, and then came back to them later when you could use them. That's what you do. You're doing it right now. He looked away. I'm not defending the texts, she said. I'm not asking you not to be hurt. I'm saying that what you read was two people talking, one of whom was lonely in her marriage, and that justifies it. No, nothing justifies anything. I'm just telling you the truth of it. She looked at her coffee. You're the one who came to this table with a plan. You saw David before you talked to me. He said nothing. That's what I mean, she said. That's exactly what I mean. They sat for a while. The snow outside had thickened slightly. Nadia wouldn't be home until 4. I'm going to fight for fair terms, Richard said finally. I assumed, and I have the texts. Amara looked at him then, a look that held something new in it, something careful. What do you mean you have them? Screenshots, printed copies. David's reviewed them. She didn't say anything for a moment. All of them? Enough of them, Richard said. She sat with that. Enough of them. She thought about the thread, its arc, its full context, the way certain sentences looked in isolation versus alongside what came before and after. She thought about the specific things Richard would choose if he were choosing strategically, and she thought about the things he would leave out. Okay, she said. She got up and rinsed her mug. He stayed at the table. She put on her coat. I'm going to take a walk, she said. She went out into the snow, and he sat in the kitchen alone, and neither of them were quite certain anymore who had the advantage. But Amara, walking down the white street with her hands in her pockets, had begun to understand the shape of what was coming, and she began quietly to prepare. The months between January and the first preliminary hearing had a texture to them, gritty, slow, full of the bureaucratic tedium of dissolving a life shared with someone. Mediators, attorneys, a parenting coordinator assigned by the court to consider Nadia's schedule, a woman named Dr. Time, Felice O'Coffer, who asked both of them in separate sessions what they hoped the next year would look like for their daughter. Richard said stability. Amara said honesty. Neither of them was wrong exactly. Richard's attorney, David Hartley, was good. Methodical, persuasive, able to construct a narrative with minimal apparent effort. The strategy he and Richard had settled on was straightforward. Present Amara's texts with Marcus as evidence of emotional infidelity and poor judgment, establish a pattern of deception, and use it to build a case for a custody arrangement that favored Richard. Not full custody. That was too aggressive, too likely to backfire. Just primary. Just enough to feel like winning. Amara found herself an attorney named Priya Menon, who had been recommended by a friend of a friend and who, in their first meeting, had listened to the entire situation, made a single page of notes, and said, "He printed which messages?" "He didn't tell me specifically, but he implied he'd been selective. He said enough of them, yes." Priya had tapped her pen against the notepad. "Okay, I want you to send me your complete message history with Marcus. Every exchange, and I want the original timestamps." Amara did, and Priya, reviewing them, found what Amara had suspected but hadn't wanted to articulate even to herself. The messages Richard had compiled were not fabricated, but they had been curated with surgical intent. Sentences that expressed frustration with the marriage were preserved. Responses that contextualized them. Marcus pushing back, Amara laughing it off. Conversations where she had also said good things about Richard, small things. A mention of a trip they'd taken before Nadia was born, were absent. It wasn't forgery. It was editing, and editing, done carefully enough, can become its own kind of lie. Priya retained a digital forensics consultant named Warren Stead, who worked primarily in corporate fraud cases and had twice testified in federal court. He was 62, quiet, deeply unimpressed by everything and exactly what the situation required. He reviewed the original thread data through Amara's account, verified timestamps against message metadata, and produced a 12-page report comparing what Richard's printed excerpts contained against what the complete record showed. The discrepancies were not minor. Priya didn't tell Amara everything that was in the report before the hearing. She said, "Be calm in there, don't try to perform anything. Just answer truthfully and let me do the rest." Richard, for his part, had convinced himself that he was not doing anything wrong. This is the most human part of him, and also the most damaging. He had genuinely revised the narrative in his own mind until the editing felt like curation, and curation felt like simply presenting the relevant truth. He had spent a professional lifetime doing this, selecting what to emphasize, what to omit, how to frame, and he had never had to distinguish between doing it for clients and doing it for himself. The line had blurred long before he printed the first screenshot. He told people, his mother, his colleague James, the friend who took him to a basketball game in March, a version of the story in which Amara had been emotionally checked out of the marriage for years, in which Marcus represented a sustained emotional affair that had poisoned the household, in which Richard himself had been blindsided and was simply fighting to protect his daughter. Each time he told it, the story settled a little more into the shape of truth in his mind. He had always been good with narrative. He did not notice that the narrative was no longer about what had happened, but about what he needed to have happened. Nadia, for her part, noticed that her parents spoke to each other only through the parenting coordinator now, and she had begun drawing the same horse over and over in her sketchbook, a gray one, running, always without a background. She didn't know why. Children often don't. The hearing was in April, in a courtroom that smelled of floor wax and recycled air. Richard presented the messages through David Hartley, who was smooth and deliberate and built the foundation carefully. 11 years of marriage, a wife who had grown emotionally distant, a documented pattern of private communication with another man, specific language from the texts suggesting dissatisfaction with the marriage and attachment to someone outside it. He quoted 3 separate messages. He submitted the printed excerpts. The judge, a woman named Carla Fenwick, who had been on the family court bench for 19 years and had heard almost every configuration of human failing that a marriage could produce, reviewed the documents with the particular patience of someone who knows that whatever she is being shown is not the whole picture. Priya Menon requested the floor. She called Warrenstead. He took the stand without ceremony, identified himself and his credentials, and then, without editorializing, without drama, walked the court through the metadata comparison in terms accessible enough that they required no translation. The timestamps on Richard's printed excerpts were accurate. The messages were real, but the thread had been selectively reproduced. He identified 11 instances in which context had been removed, responses, continuations, framing statements that materially altered the meaning of the excerpts presented. He was on the stand for 22 minutes. David Hartley's cross-examination did not go well. Richard sat at the attorney's table and watched it happen with the sensation of a man watching a structure he built being tested for load. He had known it was possible. He had not let himself believe it would actually occur. He had, in the very lawyerly way he'd been trained, constructed a scenario in which the evidence was sufficient and the strategy was sound, and had not sufficiently accounted for the thing that had always made him effective in court, that good attorneys prepare for what they can't control. Amara was across the room. She was wearing dark blue, which he had always thought suited her. She was looking at the judge, not at him. Judge Fenwick set down Warrenstead's report. She looked at Richard's table for a moment with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite disappointment, something more like recognition. Then she addressed David Hartley in measured terms about the court's view of selectively presented evidence, and the phrase bad faith appeared twice in 2 minutes. And David Hartley said several things in mitigation that the judge received with visible patience. The question of perjury charges was raised. Gently at this stage, but raised. Richard heard it, and something moved through him. Not fear exactly, though fear was somewhere underneath it. It was something closer to vertigo, the feeling of having argued a position with complete confidence and been shown in front of an audience that the confidence was the whole problem. After, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Priya collected her briefcase and Amara stood near the window at the end of the corridor. The light through it was flat, spring gray. She was not celebrating. She was not performing anything. She was just standing there, holding her phone, waiting to call Nadia's school about pickup. Richard came out of the courtroom and saw her. He stopped. His attorney was behind him, talking in a low voice about next steps and remediation and the practical difference between a contempt inquiry and an actual charge. Richard was not really listening. He looked at Amara. She looked back. It was not the look of someone who had won. It was the look of someone who had been through something and was still there, which is different from winning and costs more. Her face was tired and composed and held the specific expression of a woman who has stopped expecting something and has not yet figured out what to expect instead. He took a step toward her. She didn't move away, but something in her posture made clear that this was not an invitation. "I didn't think," he started. "I know," she said. "Amara." "Richard." Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm, the temperature of something that has finished being something else. "Call David, handle the legal piece, then call the parenting coordinator, and we'll figure out the spring schedule." "That's not what I know what you want to say." She picked up her bag from the windowsill. "I just don't know what you'd want me to do with it." She walked to the elevator. He stood where he was. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sound of a door opening somewhere below, and the low conversation of his attorney behind him, and the elevator chiming when it arrived, and Amara stepping into it without looking back. He stayed at the window after she was gone. He looked out at the gray April sky, at the parking structure across the street, at a pigeon moving along a concrete ledge with the patient indifference of things that don't know they're being watched. He thought about the yellow dress. He thought about the kitchen table on Sunday mornings. He thought about a sentence, "I can't remember," and the way he had read it as ammunition before he had allowed himself to read it as something his wife had actually felt. The thought arrived without theater that somewhere in the process of building his case, he had stopped asking whether the case was just and had only kept asking whether it was winnable. He had been wrong about which question mattered. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, let's get coffee and talk through this." Richard didn't move for another moment. Then he did, and the hallway was empty, and the window held the gray sky, and Nadia's gray horse ran through her sketchbook at home with no background behind it, running toward nothing drawn yet, or nothing that could be seen. The story of Richard Cole and Amara Cole does not end in a courtroom. It ends in small increments: a custody agreement signed on a Tuesday, a house listed in June, a September afternoon when they stood in the same school parking lot after Nadia's soccer game and spoke about nothing in particular, with the quiet, effortful civility of people who have decided that whatever else they owe each other, they owe their daughter the performance of decency. Richard, eventually, would understand what he had done, not all at once, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the slow, unguarded way that real understanding arrives, usually at inconvenient hours, in the small years after everything is over. Amara would not wait for that. She had stopped waiting for things from Richard a long time before she'd been able to name it. She would be all right. She already was. He would get there. Probably. That, in the end, was the whole of it. Not justice, not redemption, not even quite resolution. Just two people, separately carrying the specific weight of what they had been to each other, and learning, slowly, what to do with it.